let's talk about the story of Games Workshop flyers and aircraft, their introduction to the game and the problems that they caused, and how Games Workshop's balanced approach in 10th edition seems to be trying to sweep them quietly under the rug. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd focus on flyers, aircraft and Games Workshop's balance things, and a bit of an overview as to how they're being treated at the moment, which I think most people who own one would probably say not particularly well. In 10th edition, as lots of people will be well aware already, Games Workshop's unofficial balance policy seems to be that lots of units get balanced within their armies. Most units like infantry and vehicles will typically get some small nerfs and adjustments if they're overpowered, or generally points cuts or rules boosts of some sort if they're not seeing the tabletop in any sort of strong army list. And while there's still all sorts of things that you can point at as not done particularly well, in 10th edition most things for most armies are at least playable, and you can make some arguments to why you might put them on the table as opposed to other units out there. While there's a few things that are just badly balanced, there's a whole bunch of unit classes in 10th edition that the Games Workshop just clearly isn't trying to get right in any way whatsoever, and for the most part those things are flyers and fortifications, though certain examples of indirect fire are particularly underpowered as well. From just about every balance update that we've had so far, the rule seems to be that whenever a flyer or aircraft is a fairly strong unit for their faction in-game, they will generally increase the points as the first things to get nerfed, but then on the other hand, if they happen to be underpowered and nobody's playing them, they get no decreases at all. I'm not sure if there's been any flyer points drops throughout 10th edition so far. There might have been one or two, but it's very clearly deliberate and intentional, given that, say, whenever I'm making tier lists about armies and stronger and weaker units, it almost invariably tends to be the flyers and fortifications that tend to be right in the very bottom tiers of things that just don't get used, and there's no great arguments to play with them outside of rule and cool and liking the miniatures. It does just feel very at odds with their other balance philosophy. Most everything else in their codexes get help if it's underpowered or nerfed if not. So I thought for this video it'd be interesting to talk about it a little bit further, the introduction of flyers in Warhammer 40k, the problems that they've caused since in a few different forms, what the situation's like now, and a few ideas for how they might make them relevant again, while hopefully not breaking the game. Before we jump into it though, I'm just going to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Tech. They're the makers of miniature carry cases that do things really quite differently to a lot of other options. Rather than using magnets or foam, their thing is to have an interesting sort of system of plastic components holding models in place, the idea being that they grip the base, so miniatures can't rattle around and things. Their store's linked in the video description below, and they have a Kickstarter launching soon to improve and expand upon their range with their new Mechi Plus style cases. The components they use look like this, little simple machines and clips that grip onto bases, some of them spring-loaded, so basically having the effect of holding the model's base in place so they can't move or rattle around. They're then mounted in their various different cases in a whole bunch of different layers. The idea would be to have the right ones of their modules for your given army, and have a custom fit one for say something like a 40k combat patrol, or if you've got a force that you play with regularly. They do have their own pros and cons, and I'll talk through some of them and their current offerings at the end of the video, but if you're interested it could be worth checking out their Kickstarter. If you sign up for the notifications of when it goes live, which I think should be next Tuesday, they'll have some early bird 50% off discounts on their latest range of Mechi Plus cases, so it could just be something to keep an eye on for when it launches, as that's likely to be the single best deal to pick them up in the near future at least. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Getting back to it, aircraft certainly weren't always a thing that were part of mainstream Warhammer 40k. The more current line of plastic kits held from around about 5th edition to 6th edition for the most part. Before that they were kind of niche, they did exist but were generally made by Forge World. Initially some were made in metal, like that kind of infamous metal Thunderhawk miniature that couldn't support itself due to its own weight, or a few other things like Chaos Hellblades and Hell Talons. They started to release for different factions at a similar sort of era as to when they started releasing super heavies for a bunch of armies, perhaps feeling like they were trying to scale up 40k a bit, and maybe one of the easier ways that you can sell new models to people who already have an established army of one faction or another, add in big cool new units on a scale that people haven't seen before, great big centerpiece soaring aircraft moving across the battlefield, and packing a whole bunch of scary guns, or big stomping towering robots, again big centerpiece exciting kits for their armies. Certainly the first time they released, really quite a lot of the flyers were just incredibly strong in game as well. I certainly remember things like the Astra Militarum Vendetta being kind of ridiculously powerful with all the las cannons it could pack, plus being hard to kill and very mobile, and Necron Night Scythes and Doom Scythes when they came out, spamming out massive Tesla fire and glancing loads of vehicles to death. Never mind what they did to infantry. The models themselves were kind of fun and exciting, though I feel like flyers have had balance problems for basically as long as they've been around in 40k for a bunch of reasons. I think the main issue with flyers and game balance is that you've got the expectation of how they might operate in the lore. I guess air support in regular battles out there is kind of overpowered. A great big plane flies in, absolutely annihilates something, and then zooms away likely before anyone's tried to take it down. And you need specific anti-air capabilities to be able to destroy them, and all of that has to be somehow packed into an abstraction in Warhammer 40k in a turn-by-turn system taking place on a relatively small battlefield. When you've got models that basically look like supersonic jets like these Eldari flyers, there's the general sense they should be able to move incredibly fast and have great lines of sight, essentially just blasting down at the battlefield from far above, which has often meant that aircraft in the past have often been able to alpha strike the enemy on turn 1 really quite hard, zooming across the board and unloading a whole bunch of guns before the foes had any chance to react. At least for a whole bunch of editions of the game, that's often meant that if a flyer got good, it often makes sense to run loads of them as opposed to just one. Perhaps just one might zoom in, kill something, and then just get killed in return. But if you say run 3 aircraft, then they could all zoom in, absolutely take out a big chunk of the enemy army, and might overwhelm the capability to hit back at them. As well as that, there's the general expectation that flyers can't be attacked in melee either. While it's maybe kind of somewhat cinematic to imagine something like an assault marine using a jump pack to boost up to a plane and take it down with a well-placed melter bomb or something. The idea that some orc with an axe is going to be able to inflict damage on a jet that's hurtling along ridiculously fast, probably quite a long way above the battlefield in theory, just seems kind of ridiculous. And while flyers have generally had rules that mean that you can't just charge them with your basic melee troops and club them to death unless they're in hover mode and operating near the ground, that does mean that they're always going to have some issues when playing against some armies. Like say if you're playing basically ground-only melee armies, your force might literally have nothing at all that they can do about flyers and basically just have to ignore them and weather the damage that they're likely to bring all game long. That might be something that's perfectly acceptable to do, but usually that's going to feel like an advantage to the opponent and can make them a bit stronger in certain matchups than others. As well, with the image of them flying along a long way above the ground, you generally have the expectation that they shouldn't really be getting in the way of models that are trying to move in 40k. But then you also have to marry that with the actual realities of the model, which actually needs really quite big bases, as they're enormous top-heavy plastic kits that could fall over quite a bit if he just tries to balance them on something smaller. I feel like it took a few additions and iterations, but eventually Games Workshop realised that the flyer bases needs to not operate in melee or block movement in the normal ways, but even in 10th edition when they're made about as unobtrusive as possible, they can still physically block movement to certain places on the board. Like say for example, if you're trying to move forward with a vehicle with a big base, you still need to physically be able to fit that base on the other side of the flyer that you're trying to cross the path of, and if you can't, the flyer could still be basically move blocking them at least to some extent and hemming them back. Finally, things that I could think of off the top of my head was that not every army gets them as well. So if you say have an edition where flyers get really quite powerful rules, it's not like literally every army in the game can crack out their own, say the Genestealer Cult or the Sisters of Battle for example. Though admittedly that's true of really quite a lot of things in Warhammer 40k. There's a few armies out there that don't have access to infiltrators, or don't have access to indirect fire style units, and to be fair it is perfectly possible for armies to be strong in different ways, and I would probably argue that not every army having access to flyers isn't necessarily an inherent problem if they're well balanced. As a result, I feel like flyers have been a problem unit in pretty much the majority of editions at one point or another. 7th edition certainly had some obnoxious ones. I remember some of the Tyrannid flyers being kind of irritating to deal with. They had their snapfire rules where most things could only hit on a 6, so it made them ridiculously uninteractive and often just completely safe from damage against a few armies out there. In 8th edition, I remember some horrendous looking Dark Talon spams towards the start of the edition. When they first launched it, it didn't even have the rule of 3. So you could just take as many as you wanted, and given their anti-tank fire plus anti-infantry fire, they could just hoover the enemy off the board. And then even when that was a thing, certain factions that could spam a lot of flyers, particularly the Eldari ones, they could be ridiculously obnoxious. Some armies ran nothing but 9 flyers between a bunch of different datasheets, maybe with a few seers or objective grabbers in support. In 9th edition we had Abmech and Orc flyers, perhaps as the most memorable problems. 3 Stratoraptors and 3 Fusiliers just flying over and alpha striking the enemy off the table, and the same for Orc Dakka Jets and Wasp-on Blaster Jets. And when Games Workshop eventually started trying to balance and adjust their game in 8th edition, I feel like it led to a fair few reactive changes. We had the rule of 3 introduced as mentioned, that one to help spam in general, not just Dark Talons though. I think in the past they had a bit of an attempt to try and make certain units unusually good against air, things that you might expect to be in the lore, let's say Hydras and the Space Marine Hunters and Stalkers, while they were still a thing. But in general that didn't tend to work too well to actually counter them. You'd have to have flyers be really quite prevalent in the meta before taking them specifically to counter them, and even if you had taken some of them along, a massive flyer list could still potentially just go and absolutely focus those units before they get to attack. Quite a good development, I think, was when they ruled that flyers would basically have no impact on objectives, realised as Objective Control 0 in 10th edition, as I feel that's maybe giving them a weakness that does make sense in the lore. Zooming flyers 100 metres up aren't going to be retrieving Archaeotech on the ground or whatever else it is that 40k models get up to. And perhaps one of the more simple and effective things they did over the years was a hard cap on flyers. In 9th edition they said that you just basically couldn't have any more than 2 flyers per army in a 2000 point game. And I think that was quite effective, basically meaning that going for an overwhelming spam Alpha Strike just wasn't an option like the Admech and the Orcs enjoyed doing, and at least limited them to be a smaller chunk of an army list rather than a dominant force. As we've gone over the years as well, it's also interesting to see that Games Workshop don't appear to be making new aircraft units these days. Unless I'm forgetting something obvious, I believe the last aircraft models that we had were the Admech Archaeopters, the kind of fun Da Vinci style flyers that they have. And they were over 4 years ago at this point, towards the tail end of 8th edition, and that's a good bit over 4 years ago now. I don't know if at some point some decision's been taken that they want to try and take the game in a bit of a different way, and adding flyers and aircraft to 40k aren't really something they want to try and encourage massively. Maybe that's reading into the 10th edition balance system a bit too much, but compared with say 5th and 6th edition where they seem to be going through the factions and giving them all flyers, that's definitely a trend that's slowed down and stopped. For balance things though, moving on to 10th edition, the core rules for aircraft seem really quite punitive to them, though at the same time maybe they needed to be, as given that they decided to ditch the force organisation chart and also get rid of that arbitrary limitation on flyers that they had in 9th. They needed to write rules for them where in theory anyone could choose to bring an army just full of flyers if they wanted to, but based on the rules that they were giving them, that would be a bad idea. For the core rules, it does look like the hover ones on paper seem to work the best, basically just normal vehicles with fly and a 20-inch move. They still have to go around or measure to go up and over terrain like other vehicles. You can charge them in melee, they're just unusually fast and tend to pay a big premium for that big movement. Compared with what had come before though, the non-hover ones seemed like they lost a lot of capabilities. For the aircraft that don't have the hover keyword, so things like fast moving jets, they have to start in strategic reserve, so in general no turning up until turn 2 earliest, and when you do that you'll basically be turning up from the board edges, so a little bit restricted as to where they can land, and from there they have a locked flight path, having to move directly in a straight line and then pivot at the end of their move, so you're basically broadcasting where they're going to go for the next turn for your opponent. They have to move at least 20 inches, and if they've got nowhere suitable to land, they need to fly off the board and basically return into strategic reserve, essentially missing another turn of doing anything useful like shooting, so they'd already be 2 turns down on a 5-turn game. Perhaps one of the biggest draws to them, I guess, for a second turn beta strike style unit is that they ignore the obscuring penalty for ruins, so if you can draw a direct true line of sight to something, say through a window or over the top of the ruins, you might be able to draw a bead on certain targets that will be hidden to other things in your force, but the same is true of people trying to shoot them, of course. I feel like those rules can work okay for more standard shooting flyers, but for flyers who have a big bit of their value theoretically from dropping bombs, the rules really don't work out well at all. The locked flight path basically means that the opponent could just move their units out of the way and make sure they're safe from the bombing run, and even if they don't, they'd have to wait until turn 3 earliest under normal circumstances, unless you're messing around with rapid ingress. Turn 3 is already getting a little bit on the late side in the game. It's not even like the bombs when they get there are excessively powerful, usually doing something like around 3 mortal wounds or so. I'm not necessarily sure what the fix is for bombing rules, but at the moment they're almost near enough might as well not be in the game, just incredibly limited, and even when they do trigger they don't really do much. Transport rules are a little bit pointless for off-the-board style flyers. Even if you can disembark units on arrival, you could just put them in strategic reserve normally and do much the same. Though they can be quite good for certain hover flyers, maybe moving up 20 inches and disembarking. In theory that could be a premium way to get an infantry squad to the front line if those hover flyers were costed appropriately. I feel like between all that, it's kind of obvious that the core rules just aren't really all that strong for flyers and aircraft, but realistically in Warhammer 40k, if you wanted to have literally any unit strong, you could just literally slash the points cost until it got worth it for one reason or another. If all aircraft had bad rules but were really quite cheap for the amount of firepower that they could put out, they'd certainly see play, but as mentioned, Games Workshop seemed to not only want to give them kind of weakish rules for the edition in general, but also keep them incredibly expensive for those rules. Currently in Warhammer 40k though, in terms of the flyers being effective for their points cost, maybe the Drukhari Void Raven I might rate as the single best out of any of them. It's really quite expensive at over 200 points, but it still has some genuinely very scary firepower, and being able to guarantee that you can alpha strike with it and potentially see over certain ruins and things isn't really the most unhelpful. They do seem to see at least occasional competitive play. They're still not really what I'd call a staple though. Until recently, the Tau Tiger Shark might have been the single strongest flyer in the game. Again, that had pretty impressive amounts of shooting for the points, and turning up slightly late game could work quite well for things like Tau Kao Yon. But in the last updates, they gave it a massive nerf and basically said that it won't be able to shoot on the turn that it turns up, as it's too big to fit inside the normal strategic reserve location. So basically its only hope is rapid ingress or waiting until turn 3 to deal any damage. Otherwise, beyond that, a few of the rest can be acceptable enough and maybe usable casually, though very rarely seen in competitive lists. The other Tau flyers can be alright with their quad ion things. The Storm Raven can be scary enough in Ironstorm, though maybe best in Dark Angels when they've got the Dark Shrouds to give it a bit more durability. The Eldari Crimson Hunter isn't so far behind a bunch of the other fire support. It does have a few advantages, even if largely people choose to take other things, and the Night Side for Necrons can have some shenanigan potential. The Doom Scythe maybe has not terrible damage output, but certainly no better than the other Necron things that are far tougher and have other advantages. In general though, as said earlier on, there's basically just a very small selection of flyers that could be considered kind of okay. A few that are clearly behind the curve but not by so much, and then a whole bunch of them that are just outright awful for their points cost, and that encompasses quite a few of them. I feel like there might not be universal agreement as to whether or not flyers being bad is acceptable or not. I suspect that the majority of people out there will generally go with the stance that if a model exists in the game and they sell a model kit for the faction, they should aim to make the miniature worth it in game to some extent at least. That's the way that we're usually tending to want balance in Warhammer 40k, though I suspect that most people will also be on the side of not really wanting entire flyer armies to be the absolute most popular thing for their faction. It might just be a bit frustrating for the average Orc player, for example, if they were collecting the army and their faction couldn't be strong without excessive amounts of flyers. I'm sure that a bunch of people would enjoy playing their Daka squadron, but it might not appeal so much to the average player. As mentioned before, when those armies get strong, it just tends to get a bit weird, very uninteractive, with melee armies not being able to fight them properly, and can be a game that's over very quickly as you either kill the flyers trying to alpha strike you, or die, or get quickly gunned off the table if you can't. I feel like that sort of thing wouldn't be the thing that you want to wind up with, but at the same time it feels a bit weak to use that as an excuse not even to try and make them kind of acceptably usable in strong army lists, and do so in such a way that they can be viable, but outright spam of them and taking loads is discouraged in some way. It just seems a little bit unlikely to me that the balanced team at Warhammer 40k can get the majority of armies units at least somewhat playable as they have in 10th, but somehow flyers and aircraft are just completely beyond them. Generally when I've seen it discussed by people, the general sentiment tends to be that they don't want their core models to just feel like an active hindrance if they're taking them in-game, and they feel like they're handicapping their army list by bringing their Helldrake along. Or when you put a burner bomber on the table, the rules are so weak that it's not really going to have any impact on the game due to the way that flyer rules and bombs work. Some aircraft are kind of unusually iconic to the centre of some armies as well. Say the Astra Militarum Valkyrie, which is supposed to be one of the mainstay transports of the Tempestus Scions, having that relegated to be permanent garbage tier just feels like a massive blow if you're trying to make the army work, as it's not like the Tempestus Scions have lots of themed units. The same for the Deathwatch Corvus Blackstar, one of only 4 unique data sheets that they have right now, or say the Chaos Helldrake, which just cuts an iconic silhouette and tends to be a fairly popular flyer to add in as they go. Of course, there's nothing to stop you playing with any of those at the moment, but it probably is going to take at least a small amount of power away from the list, and depending on the context of the game and how strong the rest of your army is, then it could be a bit of a feels bad or just not very desirable, or put you further behind if you're playing against an opponent who you think will usually tend to beat you. On top of all that, I do feel like it's maybe just a bit deceptive on the entire marketing and selling type front. I guess Games Workshop don't put anything explicit on their boxes of aircraft and flyers that they're going to be in any way good in game. But at the same time, it's a bit weird to have a shadow balance policy that they'd never communicate officially. It might not be a great feeling for a new player who just picked up a Helldrake as one of their first models because they thought it looks cool, and then finding out that Games Workshop have this annoying thing going on where one of the first big expensive centerpiece miniatures they bought for Warhammer 40k seems to be destined just to stay incredibly bad in game, at least for all of 10th edition so far. If they did decide to rebalance them though, I feel like they'd have lots of different options. I'll just run through a few of the more obvious ideas or things I've seen discussed. Maybe the single most obvious one would just be to be a little bit braver with the points, actually give some decreases for the ones that are absolutely massively clearly overcosted, say things like the Astra Militarum Valkyrie or the Chaos Helldrake. I feel like from the evidence of what we've had in 10th edition so far, it does seem possible to have certain aircraft balanced but not auto-include. Again, say maybe the Void Raven as an okay example. Though as mentioned with the balance issues thing, I do feel like the points balance can be really quite fine. Underpowered at 1 points cost, then maybe a very narrow window where they're sort of a bit take or leave, and then at certain points cost they'll be absolutely spammed or taken for maybe problematic utility sort of rules like move blocking things, and you perhaps wouldn't want that either. Otherwise, as a different kind of option, you could rework the core flyer rules in some way. Obviously at the moment they're really not powerful, and in particular the bomb mechanic is sort of a bit non-functional. I don't know if you could do something where you could have them, say, be able to arrive from turn 1 in your own deployment zone perhaps, or even do some sort of rapid ingress into your own deployment zone potentially turn 1. I guess if so, that would stop a turn 1 alpha strike with them being able to shoot at things within the enemy deployment zone, and force them to weather a little bit of shooting, and then maybe have the option for bombing things on turn 2. That one feels a little bit more acceptable in terms of bombers coming in perhaps. That maybe could bring back a little bit of problems like flyer move blocking, say maybe parking a flyer on objective on turn 2 so your opponent can't get to it if they haven't had a chance to move up to it yet. Otherwise you could go back to older styles of movement, maybe pivoting before movement rather than after, or perhaps if you're willing to go with a bit of a weird abstraction, you could just treat them all as having hover. That would allow melee armies to interact with them, but it might be quite immersion breaking, and even if it could make for a more balanced game, still wouldn't really make a lot of sense for orcs punching to death planes with a power claw. Otherwise you could just perhaps bring back that cap that they had for tournament play perhaps, maybe 1 flyer maximum per 1000 points, or some sort of percentage points cap limit, if you didn't have the ability to spam 3 of every single flyer datasheet out there. Games Workshop might be able to afford to make their points cost a little bit better, maybe in a similar sort of way as epic heroes aren't going to be spammed. It could allow them to be a bit braver with some of their rules. Another thing that I suspect they wouldn't do, but could be a way to sort of make a soft cap on them, would be things like scaling points cost perhaps. Have your first flyer that you're buying at a points cost where it might be a good option all by itself, but obviously try and make it not auto-include. And then say if you take a second aircraft datasheet of any sort, that'd cost an extra 30 points, and then another 30 points above that for the next one. And hopefully that should balance out any sort of problems that you get by mass flyers trying to do big style move blocks or overwhelming alpha strikes. I'm not sure that would work great though for armies that might want to use several as transport options, say Guard Air Cavalry or Corvus Black Stars. Maybe wouldn't work quite so well if you want to use them as workhorse transports. Otherwise, and maybe unlikely in 10th edition, you could maybe try and change their battlefield role, perhaps giving them some sort of supporting roles for things on the ground, maybe making a big part of what they do, things like suppressing the enemies for a -1 to hit, or other debuffs that would be useful to have maybe 1 copy of, like certain unit special rules, but you might get diminishing returns if you take more. They'd still be able to do some of their own damage, but their points cost likely wouldn't be as efficient for that if they're providing some sort of valuable support, as well as just their speed, attack and defense, as often seems to be the case now. In any case though, doesn't seem like it's going to be the best time to be playing aircraft in Warhammer 40k. I guess Games Workshop in theory could change it at literally any point that they fancied, and at any balance pass they could do a big update where they try and focus on making aircraft a bigger part of the core game once more. Though if that is part of the grand plan to start selling more aircraft models at some point, they don't really seem to have given too many indications of it yet. I'll certainly be interested to hear what you guys think of it though. Do you think that the issue of flyers in 40k is one that needs fixing? And if so, how would you go about doing so? I look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments as always. Finally though, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Tech. As mentioned earlier on, creators of these Mechi carry cases, a slightly different option for transporting 40k miniatures with their small grippy components and things to hold bases and entire models in place as you transport forces from A to B. Obviously every miniature transport system comes with a few pros and cons. With their clipping components that need to be tailored to the right base sizes, I feel like these ones are interesting and pretty satisfying to use, but perhaps a little bit better suited to people's models and collections that are going to be at least fairly stable and playing with the same thing quite a lot. They seem really quite suited to things like Combat Patrol, or potentially an 1000-point army that you're going to play with quite a bit. They certainly can fit 2000 points in some of the bigger cases if you've got one that's consistent. You can swap out the components and things, but it will just require having access to some of them. You can buy in extra ones from their websites, though the cases do come with ones included. For the positives though, they certainly look very nice and feel very satisfying to use. Really quite cool to have a custom built solution to hold the base of each and every model in the army, and you can set them up as to your preferences, with miniature storage either on the base of the cases or the sides as necessary, and it can be reconfigured. Compared with things like magnetic cases as well, there's no need to mount magnets on the bases as well if that's something that you didn't want to do for your own collection, so I guess that's one advantage there. For potential downsides, it could maybe be a little bit less speedy than certain solutions for getting things in and out due to having to operate each simple component when you do so. I've seen a few describe them as over-engineered, which they might be to some extent, but they're still pretty fun to use and well made. I feel that might be a little bit more of a problem for really big armies trying to be transported around as opposed to smaller ones, but that's just my own take. Otherwise, there's just a slight lack of flexibility. Though you could say that of certain other options as well. Certainly things like foam cases where you might need to try and create specific bits for different model sizes, and other ones have their own trade-offs like magnets having to actually do the work to magnetize all the bases, which might work a little bit better for some things than others. In any case though, as mentioned, their Kickstarter's launching on Tuesday the 12th of November if you want to check that out, linked in the video description. Beyond that though, they've still got their current range of cases on sale. Their standard offering are these slider cases, 4 different sizes of them, and you can get a rough idea as to their scaling as per pictures on their website. You can see the 6 module one for $88 here, transporting a small force of AdMech. They've got a bit more of a lower budget basic box sort of affair as well. These ones called their Mechi pods and can be used as inserts for things like the Sistel Battle or Crusade cases. They make some other fun stuff as well, things like some monster display cases that can be mounted on the wall, and these ones have a little light to illuminate your creations as they're being stored, which is kind of fun. There may be slightly bulky cases for transporting one miniature, though to be fair I feel like there's very rarely good solutions to transporting these big greater demons and things. Games Workshop do like to make them really quite big and top heavy and have a whole bunch of fragile bits right at the top. They do often tend to be a challenge however you go about them. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check out their Kickstarter for the early bird discounts on Tuesday, and their general web store links down in the video description if you've got any interest in some snazzy carry cases with clippy base components. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Look forward to hearing all your takes on the flyers and things down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. Otherwise, feel free to check out the channel's Patreon page and all the other stuff down in the video description. But otherwise, I'll be back for another video in the not too distant future. It's probably going to be a news roundup or Space Marines for the next one. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.